second as well. I haven't muted you lot, but you're such good people, I don't really need to mute you. Okay, thank you for joining me again. We are on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph 13a of the first parak of Yuma. And let me just remind you what we did last week very briefly before we carry on this week. This week's show is going to be, well, for some people, particularly interesting. It'll deal with matters of life and death and probabilities and likelihoods and risks and stuff like that. So if you're into that sort of topic, then you'll enjoy today's shiur. We looked at the Mishnah again in our discussion of the Gemara last week, and we found that there was a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim in the very original Mishnah, which the Gemara brought, in the situation of whether we prepare another wife for the Kohen Gadol, just in case his wife were to die on Yom Kippur and end up being wifeless. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Rabbi Yehuda says that essentially we ask the Kohen Gadol to marry another wife on Erev Yom Kippur. So he has a wife in spare. So that even if his real wife were to die, he would still have a wife to spare. That's Rabbi Yehuda. But the Chachamim, the sages, say there's no need to do this. Come on, we don't need to do this. Don't give him an endless list of wives to bother with. So that's the Chachamim. However, they both agreed that we do prepare an additional Kohen Gadol in the wings. And we spend more time discussing this in previous weeks. A second Kohen Gadol, not in case the Kohen Gadol dies, surprisingly enough, although that itself is another risk, but in case the Kohen Gadol who's being prepared, the main Kohen Gadol, encounters some sort of tumah or psul that would make him invalid in terms of performing the Yom Kippur Avodah. And if that could happen, someone could die on him suddenly, he could bump into a rat or something, or some matter that would render him unsuitable to do the service. So we have another Kohen Gadol who has been got ready, and he will step in as the understudy on Yom Kippur, should that be the case. And both Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham agreed that would be necessary. Where they disagree is to whether we should give the Kohen Gadol a second wife in the wings, as well as the second Kohen Gadol, whether he, the first Kohen Gadol, should actually have a second wife. Now, why should he have a second wife? Because the Pasuk says that as one of the requirements of the Yom Kippur Avodah, he has to carry out an atonement on behalf of him and his household. And the Pasuk says, "V'chiper ba'ado u'ba'ad beiso." He has to atone for himself, as well as for the general people of Israel. He has to atone for himself, u'ba'ad beiso, and for his household. And the Chachamim have always understood beiso in this context to mean his household means his wife. Yeah, your wife is the Akeret Habayit. So therefore, the Beiso being referred to is his wife, which suggests that the Kohen Gadol needs to have a wife. If he has no wife, then he can't carry out this aspect of the Pasuk. So he needs to be married. So we have a Kohen Gadol who is married, but what would be the case if she were to suddenly die on Yom Kippur? And he would find, if she were to die on Erev Yom Kippur, then they quickly find him another wife, and, he would be married again. But if she were to die during Yom Kippur, you might say, fat chance. But the Gemara is going to discuss whether this is a fat chance or a thin chance in a moment. Then he would be wifeless, and therefore he would not be covered by this verse. He would have no beso to be mechaper for. And that would invalidate him as being the Kohen Gadol, and that's a big tragedy on Yom Kippur. So therefore we have a difference of opinion as to whether we should already marry him into someone extra on Erev Yom Kippur. So he has this wife in the wings anyway. As long as two wives don't die on him, and that's actually going to be the subject of the discussion in the Gemara, he would be all right. Having at least one wife to survive would seem to be enough to fit the picture in the Pasuk. Okay, so now the Gemara I'm going to take you to, and we will look at all these discussions. Some of the discussions become quite bizarre, but they're entertaining as well as bizarre. So I hope you'll enjoy the Gemara. We're on 13a, Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, and we're 5 lines down from the top. After the 2 dots, there are 2 dots in the middle of that line, and then Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now this statement, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af isha acheres maskinin lo, that this is actually a quote from our original Mishnah. That Rabbi Yehuda, unlike the Chachamim, Rabbi Yehuda himself holds that we also prepare for him, as he puts it, Rabbi Yehuda puts it, another wife. So that if his wife, his real wife, were to die, he would have at least this second wife, and therefore be able to carry out the Yom Kippur Avodah. So the Gemara now asks about the Chachamim, the Rabbanon as they're called over here, who argue with Rabbi Yehuda and say there's no need for a second wife. Why is it that they believe there's no need for a second wife? That's the Gemara's question. The Gemara asks as follows: Rabbanon nami, what about the Rabbanon as well? Hoi chaishi l'shema. We see that the Chachamim, who argue with Rabbi Yehuda, do concern themselves with risk. What does that mean? They agreed with Rabbi Yehuda that when it comes to the possibility of the Kohen Gadol becoming Tomei, that there was a risk of that, and therefore we should arrange a second Kohen Gadol to step in case the first Kohen Gadol becomes Tomei. So you can see that in principle, the Chachamim are also cautious. They're concerned that an event may take place that would invalidate the Kohen Gadol and make him unable to do the Yom Kippur Avodah. The event they're concerned about is Tumah, that suddenly the Kohen Gadol becomes Tomei, and therefore we need to meet this concern by appointing an understudy to take his place. Well, if they are concerned about small possibilities, the Gemara asks, why are they not, like Rabbi Yehuda, also concerned about the small possibility of the Kohen Gadol's wife dying? Why are they concerned about the possibility of Tumah suddenly being inflicted on the Kohen Gadol, and therefore they require a substitute Kohen Gadol, and not be concerned about the death of the wife, and therefore require a second wife? Rabbi Yehuda is concerned, but not Chachamim. You just share a screen with you so we can just see that clearly. Share screen. That's not share screen, is it? Yes, it is share screen. Okay, I'm using Google Docs and not Word. Word died on me, so I'm using a different application here. I wasn't sure it was going to work. So you see at the top, I just give you the different opinions. The Chachamim, who argue with Rabbi Yehuda, they say, you prepare a second Kohen Gadol, but not a second wife. But Rabbi Yehuda holds, you prepare a second Kohen Gadol and you prepare a second wife. Rabbi Yehuda is concerned about anything that might happen, whether it's the death of the Kohen Gadol or whether it's a tumor for the Kohen Gadol, the death of the wife of the Kohen Gadol. And therefore, he likes to make sure that we're covered in all contingencies. But the Chachamim are only concerned about Tomei, the Kohen Gadol becoming Tomei, but not about the wife dying. And the Gemara wants to know, it is curious to know why the Chachamim are so sure that the Kohen Gadol's wife will not die. So it seems, is she eternal? Is she immortal? Or what is it? Why aren't they concerned? And the Gemara's answer is a very simple answer. We go back to the Gemara, and it's something that we would perhaps have also have answered in this situation as well. The Chachamim would argue to you and say, I'm not afraid about the possibility of the wife of a Kohen Gadol dying for the following reason. Tum shechicha misa lo shchicha. It's a bland statement that needs a little bit of explanation. Tumah, the possibility of the Kohen Gadol becoming Tomei because he encounters something that makes him Tomei, is something that is relatively, what shall we say, probable. Relatively probable. These things happen. I mean, how long is a piece of string? I'm not going to measure it, what the probability is. Be nice to know. But it's relatively probable. And therefore, the Chacham say, for this reason, we want to make sure there's an understudy Kohen Gadol, just in case the Kohen Gadol becomes Tomei. However, I say to you, says the Chachamim, misa lo shchicha, death is not relatively probable. Now you'll say to me, doesn't it depend upon the age of the Cohen Gadol's wife, her state of health? Maybe she needs to go through a medical inspection before Yom Kippur, just to see how relatively probable or improbable it is. Nevertheless, the Gemara doesn't discuss that for the moment, but it suggests that we're talking about a Kohen Gadol who's obviously a fairly strong person himself, because the Yom Kippur avoda requires a lot of stamina. So he's probably relatively young. If he's relatively young, then his wife is probably relatively young. There's no reason to believe that we should be concerned of the sudden death of a relatively young wife precisely on the day of Yom Kippur. Clearly, if she's tottering on the point of death on Erev Yom Kippur, we might have a different situation here. We're talking about a case of a sudden death. A sudden death not preceded by an illness is relatively improbable, so the Chacham is saying we don't bother to ask the Kohen Gadol to marry a second wife, because it is so unlikely that his real first wife will die on him. That's the difference. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you see, Rabbi Yehuda says you do ask for a second wife to marry the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur. Clearly, he seems to be more concerned about minor possibilities. But the Chachamim say it's very important to know which risks are significant, which aren't. The risk of tumah is significant. The risk of mortality overnight is not significant. And that's the simple answer the Chachamim give. So now the Gemara goes on, and there are challenges that the Rabbi Yehuda says to the Chacham. Amrullah, the Chacham has said now to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda did ask for a second wife to be made because he is concerned. The Chacham is not concerned about it, but the Rabbi Yehuda does. So the Chacham now challenge Rabbi Yehuda. If you are concerned about the sudden death of the wife of the Kohen Gadol, and you seem to be, because you are recommending that the Kohen Gadol marry a second wife on Erev Yom Kippur because of that potential contingency. Im Kain, if you're so scared about minor contingencies, like the possibility of a healthy woman dying overnight, Ein Ladava Sof, there's no limit to the number of things you should be frightened about. And what he really means over here is that why are you just asking for one wife to be appointed? Maybe he should be asked to marry 15 extra women on Erev Yom Kippur, because who says that the second wife won't die as well as the first, and the third as well as the second, and the first and the fourth, etc. Ein la davar sof. Really, what Chachamim was saying, look, it's unlikely that a wife will die suddenly anyway. But if you're concerned about that unlikely, maybe you should be concerned about the unlikely, and the unlikely, and go on forever. In other words, this is a sarcastic comment that the Chachamim are making to Rabbi Yehuda. Don't bother, they say, the Chachamim say, to do this at all. If you're so scared of these things, there is no limit, and just setting one wife extra is not enough. You should recommend marrying 10 extra wives. So this is a scathing rebuttal the Chachamim have to Rabbi Yehuda's position of instituting a second wife. So the Gemara now carries on, makes a comment. The Chachamim really hit Rabbi Yehuda very hard, saying, don't be so stupid and ask that a second wife be appointed, because really that's such a low risk that if you're worried about that low risk, you should be worried about lower and lower and lower risks. And there's really no limit to the amount of frightener that this situation might place on you. So Gemara says, Shapek Amri La Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim said this very logically to Rabbi Yehuda. What would Rabbi Yehuda respond to defend his position? Rabbi Yehuda is saying, I'm worried about a small risk, and therefore I ask for another wife, but I'm not asking for a second wife and a third wife and a fourth wife. Why not? If you're so worried about every single small potential contingency, maybe you should be worried about many wives dying on him. So Rabbi Yehuda will answer to the Chachamim over here, Rabbi Yehuda Amalacha, let's be sensible about this, Mr. Chachamim. Mr. Chacham, you say that I'm so concerned about the death of the wife that maybe I should be concerned about the death of 2 wives and 3 wives and 4 wives, and it just goes on forever. Don't be silly. Rabbi Yehuda says to the Chachamim, and he gives them a very logical answer, of course. He says, haven't you learned your simple binomial probabilities? Don't you know? Lemisa de chada chayeshinan, lemisa de tarti lo chayeshinan. I am worried about slight risks, so I do recommend the marrying of an additional wife to the Kohen Gadol. However, I know my maths well enough to know that if the death of one wife is a low probability, which does concern me, the death on the same day of two wives is much, much lower probability. And there is a limit to how far I think we need the halacha to step in. It steps in to provide the first tier of protection against the death of one wife. But the death of two wives is increasingly improbable, and therefore I don't ask for a second wife and a third wife and a fourth wife, just a second wife, but not a third and a fourth and a fifth, etc., etc. I mean, very simply, if the probability of one wife dying on a particular day is 10%, it's going to be much less than that. But if it were 10%, and you have a second wife, and her probability of dying on a day is also 10%, the combined probability of both dying on the same day, you multiply the two together, is 1%. And essentially, this is the answer. Rabbi Yehuda is saying that, yes, I'm afraid of the small percentage probability of his true wife dying. And therefore, I think we need another wife as well. But I'm not concerned about the combined probability of both of them dying. That's so unlikely that I won't ask for more. And therefore, he's saying the Chachamim being stupid and even challenging him. Because the Chachamim's challenge was, well, if you're already afraid of the death of wife one, why aren't you afraid of the death of wife two and wife three and wife four? That statement seemed to be a bit extreme. So the Gemara is actually now going to go and challenge the Chachamim. says the Gemara now, for Rabbanon, why is it the Chachamim even challenge Rabbi Yehuda in the first place? The Gemara is now asking, going back to the other side. The Rabbanon challenged Rabbi Yehuda and said, look, Rabbi Yehuda, it's very unlikely that one wife will die. And yet you're asking for the Kohen Gadol to marry a second wife just in case. If you, and this is what they went on saying, which the Gemara is trying to understand, if you're worried already for a small possibility of one wife dying, why aren't you also worried for the small possibility of two wives dying, and maybe with another wife, three wives dying, and four wives dying? This is the challenge that Chacham has said to Rabbi Yehuda. But it was a silly challenge, wasn't it? Because as Rabbi Yehuda answered, the possibility of two wives dying is even less than the possibility of one. If three wives would be even less. Obviously, it's enough to have only one understudy wife, because you don't need a second understudy wife, because it's almost incredibly unlikely that they will all die at the same time. That's what was the defense made by Rabbi Yehuda. So why were the Chachamim saying, if you're already worried about wife one dying, why aren't you also worried about both wives dying? I've explained to you, the probability of one wife dying may be 10%. The probability of two wives dying is only 1%. It's quite right that Rabbi Yehuda only wanted to arrange one extra wife rather than two extra wives. What was even this challenge? Don't the Chachamim know the simple rules that you multiply two probabilities together to see what the likelihood is of the combined set of wives all dying on the same day? Don't they know that simple fact? That's the Gemara's challenge. So the Gemara answers for the Chachamim, and let's look at this answer. It's very strange. If the Chachamim were really saying, once you are concerned about the death of one wife, despite the fact that the probability is low, that's what they're saying to Rabbi Yehuda. If you're already concerned for the death of one wife, even though the probability is low, afila lemisa de train shinan, and on that basis, you should be worried about the death of two and the death of three and death of four. What kind of answer is that? It's not true. The death of two and three and four is even more likely. So what do you mean if you're worried about, this is what the Chachamim is saying. This sounds like a nonsense statement. The Chachamim is saying, if you're worried about X, you should be worried about Y and Z. Not at all. the probability of the first wife dying, all right, I'll give it to you, Rabbi Yehuda. That's a 10% chance. Let's have another wife. But who says that Rabbi Yehuda should recommend another understudy and a third understudy and a fourth understudy? That will mean that you expect dozens of wives to die. Rabbi Yehuda is sensible to just ask for one wife. Why is he being accused of being illogical in only asking for one understudy? It's very logical that he's only asking for one understudy, because one understudy is enough. Because it's unlikely that both the real wife and the understudy will die on the same time. So you don't need a third wife, obviously. So how do we understand this Gemara? So the answer of how we understand the Gemara, I could only find one. There is a note, that tells me that somehow it's a matter of principle. That's one answer to try and understand it. If you're already were afraid of a small risk, then Rabbi Yehuda should be aware. You should be worried about a very small risk, and a very, very, very small risk, and a very, 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 very small risk. That's the way some of the Rishonim explain it, which to me as a mathematician doesn't make sense, because there's a difference between a small risk, a very small risk, and a very, very small risk. So I don't understand that at all. So I found an answer, and I'll share you this answer, a remarkable answer, but it will shake you to the core when I share this answer with you. I'll show it on screen. This is from the Ritva. And he's explaining why the risk of one wife dying is the same as the risk of two wives dying, is the same as the risk of three wives dying, is the same as the risk of 1,000 wives all dying on the same day. Isn't that nonsense? It's not nonsense. Now listen to the Ritva. So let's look at the block prints, and he gives us a striking reason for why, no matter how many wives the man has, they may all die at the same time. Tohocha, toha'isha bria. Since we know that his main wife is healthy, the only reason we should be concerned about her death, that she suddenly drops dead on Yom Kippur, is mishum shema mazal o avon de kohen goreim, is on account of the fact that maybe the bad mazel or the sinfulness of her husband, the Kohen Gadol, may bring about her death. Shelo yichaper al beiso, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want this Kohen Gadol to serve as a Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. Wants him out of the way. He's a nasty fellow. And what does he do then? Strikes down the wife, so that now, sounds like striking down the wrong person, doesn't it? Strikes down the wife so that the Kohen Gadol is now single and he can't carry out the service. Well, if that's the case, the risks of two wives dying on the same day and 3 and 4 and 5 is all the same. You know why? Because if the only reason that even one wife is likely to die is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants this Kohen Gadol to be single on the day of Yom Kippur so that he can't do the Yom Kippur Avodah because he's not worthy of it, then even if you get this Kohen Gadol married to 15 wives on Erev Yom Kippur, HaKadosh Baruch Hu may strike all 15 down in order that he's single. So the probability of death of 15 wives is the same as the probability of death of one wife, because it doesn't depend upon their health. It depends upon the status and the iniquity of the Kohen Gadol. Extraordinary pshat. Mathematically it answers the question. It's the difference between independent probabilities and dependent probabilities in maths, really. We're saying that the probabilities of each wife dying is not independent of each other. It all depends upon one contingency, is this Kohen Gadol worthy? And therefore, the Chachamim was saying to Rabbi Yehuda, according to this, we don't think, Rabbi Yehuda, you really think it's very likely that the Kohen Gadol's wife is going to die on Yom Kippur. Just dropped dead, a healthy woman. She was all right the day before, now she drops dead. The only reason you could possibly say that is because you think that somehow her husband may be unworthy, the Kohen Gadol, and this is a way of making sure he becomes single for the next day and can't perform the service. If that is really in the back of your mind, Rabbi Yehuda, then you should be also concerned about a second wife and a third wife and a fourth wife. There's no end to it. So what are you going to gain by even giving him one extra wife? Yes, it's all going to depend upon the Kohen Gadol. Nothing's going to work. I say don't prepare a second wife at all. You say prepare a second wife. What I'm telling you, says Chacham Rabbi Yehuda, preparing a second wife isn't going to get you anywhere. Even preparing 100 wives isn't going to get you anywhere, because if the Kohen Gadol's worthy, they'll live, and if the Kohen Gadol's unworthy, they won't live. Shout to the Ritva. Remarkable. Anyway, I'll stop sharing at this point. The Ritva is the only one who gives this answer. It's a brilliant answer in answering the mathematics as to why, it should be the same as small risk as a small. He's now saying it's all one risk. It's the same risk no matter how many women you have there. But it is striking in terms of essentially placing, if you like, the mortality risk of the wives in relation to the worthiness of the Kohen Gadol, their husband, and saying that this might be all to ensure that the Kohen Gadol is single on the day of Yom Kippur. Okay, you may not like this particular, I'm sure the women won't particularly like this particular response to the Gemara, but it's a brilliant response and answers the question in terms of likelihoods. Okay, so where are we now? Okay, so this was just a to and fro on whether you should have or you shouldn't have a second wife. We've come to no conclusion on this. We still have a Chachamim saying no need for an extra wife at all. The whole thing is absurd. Rabbi Yehuda saying one extra wife we prepare. That's where we stand. It's a machlokas. We've just gone through this dialogue between them, so to speak, in which each tries to prove that the other one's case is illogical. So now let's go on to the Gemara. The Gemara now says, V'Rabbanon neimru inhu lenafshayhu. They have something to explain as well. Second. Yes, on the basis of the logic that the Chachamim have just made, the Gemara wants to say that if you're afraid of one small risk, then you should be afraid of, even smaller risks and smaller risks happening. The Gemara is actually says the Chachamim, in a sense, have shot themselves in the feet, because what do they say as far as the risks of Tumah are concerned? Where we prepare a second Kohen Gadol, the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Yehuda that you do prepare a second Kohen Gadol, just in case the first Kohen Gadol becomes Tomei and is unable to complete the service. But if that's the case, according to the Chachamim's own logic, their logic was, if you're afraid of a small risk, you should be afraid of a smaller risk and a smaller risk. If you already, they said to Rabbi Yehuda, if you prepare one extra wife, Rabbi Yehuda, then maybe should be a second extra wife and a third extra wife and a fourth extra wife. The Gemara is now saying that the Chacham themselves have to give an explanation. Why is it they only require one extra Kohen Gadol in case the Kohen Gadol gets a psul or becomes Tomei? Why? They have to question themselves. They consider that once you consider a small risk as a problem, then another even small risk is a problem. So it's not enough just to have one extra Kohen Gadol, because if you had one extra Kohen Gadol, maybe both of them become Tomei. Maybe you should have a second extra Kohen Gadol, and maybe all three of them will become. Maybe you should have another extra. So this is what the Gemara is asking of a Rabbanon. The counter you made to Rabbi Yehuda suggests that someone, as soon as they're concerned about some small extra risk, there's an einad of a sof. Then there's no end to the number of people and contingencies that you've got to arrange for that. And it's all observed. Well, the Chacham say it's quite enough to have one extra Kohen Gadol in case the main Kohen Gadol becomes Tomei. They don't say you need to have a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth. And they certainly don't say to themselves, Eina Dova so. They're happy with one extra Kohen Gadol. So it seems they're not looking at smaller and smaller risks. It seems to be in contrast to their argument we've just seen now. They should require 1,000 extra Kohanim Gadolim, or say it's just not worth doing it at all, but they don't. They say one extra Kohen Gadol is enough. So the Gemara answers here quite nicely. Omer Rabbanon. The Chacham would answer, no, don't be silly. Tuma is not the same as Misa. The probability of a person becoming Tome is not the same as the probability of a person dying, like the wife of the Kohen Gadol. Why? Because Tuma, becoming Tome or not Tome, is to some extent in your hands. How careful are you going to be? Dropping dead of a sudden heart failure is not in your hands. So, as the Gemara now says, Rabban will say the reason we don't need a second and a third and a fourth extra Kohen Gadol, we don't have to concern ourselves with such a minor probabilities as a whole fleet of Kohanim Gedolim all becoming Tomei precisely within a half an hour time frame. The reason we don't worry about that is because Kohen Gadol Zoriz who? A Kohen Gadol, the word to translate Zoriz here, is vigilant. A Kohen, every Kohen, we say Kohanim Zorizenheim, actually it's a general statement that Kohanim are zealous and they're vigilant individuals. The Kohen Gadol is the most zealous and vigilant individual of the lot. So therefore, it's enough to be worried about one particular Kohen becoming Tomei. He's going to be very careful. He doesn't want to become Tomei. He wants to do the service tomorrow on Yom Kippur. It's the grandest event of the year. He wants to do it himself. He doesn't want to become Tomei. He's going to avoid as many undesirable situations over the next few days as he can to prevent himself becoming Tomei. Death is unavoidable. That's why they said, well, if you're worried about one risk, you may be worried about other risks as well. But since tumor is something which is avoidable, although every now and again something can happen beyond your control, but generally it's avoidable, it's quite enough, say the Chachamim, to have one extra Kohen Gadol in place, and that would be sufficient because it's even unlikely that the main Kohen Gadol will get anything, and that the two vigilant Kohanim Gadolim would both become Tomei at the same time is completely ridiculous. So that's the answer which the Chacham will give to defend the fact that it is enough to be worried about one Kohen Gadol becoming Tomei, and you only need therefore one understudy. But then the Gemara comes back to this, really saying, well, if you insist that a particular Kohen Gadol is Zoriz, is vigilant, every Kohen Gadol is very much on the guard against stray rats and corpses over his path, and therefore he's not going to trip over any of these in the next few days. If that's the case, Lama Maskiden Kohen Acher, why do you even ask for the first Kohen, the first understudy? The Gemara is turning it, so to speak, on its head. You're saying that a Kohen is vigilant because a lot of the exposure to tumor to some extent is under his control. If that's the case, it's highly unlikely that any Kohen Gadol, even one on his own, will become Tomei because he's vigilant. So why do you ask for any understudy? I mean, you could say, well, it depends how vigilant, how not vigilant, but the Gemara is trying it out over here. Once you say that a Kohen Gadol is vigilant, why do we even need a single understudy? Okay, you might be able to understand when it comes to mortality that's outside your control, but when it comes to something in your control, and you're saying that Kohen Gadol is extremely cautious about what he encounters, then let him have no understudy. It's enough just for this Kohen Gadol to be vigilant. So the Gemara answers, why is it that we prepare another Kohen Gadol? This answer is so remarkable that it will have you thinking for the rest of the week. You wouldn't expect this answer to come out. Says the Gemara actually answers with something which is totally ironic. Kiven of dinan leit sora, kol shekain to misdores tfei. By arranging an understudy, the first Kohen Gadol will be even more vigilant. The Gemara again is getting a remarkable thing. You might think he should be less vigilant because there's somebody else to take his place. No, he'll be more vigilant. You know why? Human nature. Terrible thing to say. You know what? There's nothing more that a Kohen Gadol will resent just the day before Yom Kippur than the thought that he's gone through all these rehearsals, he knows exactly what to do. Tomorrow is his big day, but you know what? there's a guy behind him who has been arranged as the alternate Cohen Gadol, the understudy, who's raring to go, praying that the first Cohen Gadol will become Tomei so he can take his place. In that situation, what does the main Cohen Gadol say to himself? I am determined that I don't lose my place as Cohen Gadol. I'm going to be even more careful to make sure I don't become Tomei because I don't want this guy behind me. In other words, you create for him a sort of big brother behind him deliberately to create this sense of competition so that the first Cohen Gadol's even more careful. Have you ever heard anything like this before? Tremendous response over here. But it seems so strange because we seem to be somehow imputing into the nature of the Cohen Gadol this idea of being jealous, looking over his shoulder, suspicious, casting aspersions on other people. And yet that's what we're showing here in this Gemara. Gemara is being extremely frank. There is absolutely nothing hidden here about the way people interact. We have a Cohen Gadol who's supposed to be at the top of the spiritual level of the Jewish people, but we consider him to be a human being. Yeah, we're not talking about the virgin birth. He's a human being. And as a human being, he doesn't shed some of these character flaws. They're with him as well. He's prepared to become a Cohen Gadol, and if he has what seems to be a competitor standing right behind him, he'll be even more careful to make sure that competitor doesn't take his place. And therefore, you're increasing his reasons, you're increasing his vigilance by having the guy behind him, the understudy. Very interesting idea that Gemara places us over here. Okay, so that's why we have an understudy for the Cohen Gadol. Says Chachamim, even though the Cohen Gadol himself is vigilant and may well never need to take advantage of the understudy, but having the understudy actually helps him become more vigilant, which means that the understudy almost never gets a chance of being the Cohen Gadol, because the first Cohen Gadol is probably going to lock himself up in cotton wool over a week to make sure that he actually remains tahar for the ceremony. Okay. 1 second. Okay, now the Gemara is going to ask other kashas. This is extremely interesting Gemara because there's a mixture of ritual and human nature weave in and out of each other in a very, very surprising way. So the Gemara now has another question. Okay, we understand that at least according to Rabbi Yehuda, only according to Rabbi Yehuda, a second wife, so to speak, is prepared. We had all this discussion about it just a few moments ago. We prepare a second wife for him. So the Gemara says, how is this going to work in practice, halachically? Umi sagile betakanta. Is there enough in just preparing? It said matkinin lo. It doesn't say we marry him over. What does it actually mean? We prepare for him a second wife. If I say to you, I'm preparing for myself a second wife, what does that mean? Preparing. Someone sitting on the doorstep waiting for me to be Mekadesh? Do I give her Kedushin? What's actually happening in this statement? What does that mean? So the Gemara thinks that this means that maybe that we just have a woman waiting in the wings. He doesn't actually marry her. This is the Gemara's first gambit, but she's right nearby. So the moment if his wife were to die, there's a quick telegram that gets sent out. How do we know the wife dies, all of a sudden? But let's assume we do know. Yeah, a messenger comes running, and this woman who's been sitting there filing her nails suddenly gets pulled up to the Cohen Gadol, and he says, hurry up, Megadeshusly. Is that what it means? The Gemara at first suggests that might be the case, but what happens if she dies, his main wife dies on Yom Kippur? He can't marry the second woman on Yom Kippur. Can you imagine? It's already Yom Kippur morning, and he's about to carry out the avodah. The telegraphic rider comes in saying that his wife has died. You need another wife very quickly. They bring this wife in on Yom Kippur in the morning while you're at shul, saying your shacharis, and so to speak, and he marries her there. First of all, there's a real shaila. Are you allowed to marry a woman on a Shabbos or Yom Tov? Any woman in any situation, let alone a Yom Kippur. Very, very dubious. Very dubious. So how is it going to help to have this woman in the wings? You know, under certain contingencies, she's not married to him, and his wife's died already. It's not going to help. That's what the Gemara says. Beso or Amar Rahmana, v'hai lav besohu. The Torah says that he should be chippah ba'ado ba'ad beso. But he hasn't married this woman in the wings yet, and he can't marry her on Yom Kippur itself, so he's not going to be able to be a mechapa for his beso anyway. It's too they haven't got far enough in the proceedings for her to be his wife. So the Gemara says, yes, I agree. That cannot be the situation when it said maskin. And no, the Gemara says, it's true. Before Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur, just before, Kol Nidreg, this woman is brought up to him. I don't know whether he has any say in the matter, whether he approves of her, doesn't approve, he fancies her, he doesn't fancy her, she fancies him, she doesn't fancy him. I don't know. But it says, hurry up, Megadechesli, just before Kol Nidre. Well, that's allowed. And he gives her something, and she's now Begudeshes, and therefore doesn't matter if his other wife were to die, fine, like no big deal. He's now married to this woman. It's not chuppah, as the Gemara is going to say. This is the first stage, Hariyat Megudeshesli, but she's married to him. At which point the Gemara challenges that even this wouldn't work. Says the Gemara, as long as he hasn't done nisuin, the second stage of marriage, she cannot be considered yet to be beso. If all he's done is give her kedushin. Remember that they used to do these things in two stages, and they're two halachically distinct stages, except we do them nowadays together under the chuppah. We do them in an absurd way. And originally, the idea was stage one, a man gives the woman the ring or whatever, and he says, Hariyat Mekudeshes lead, there are witnesses, etc. And at this point, they are officially married, to the extent that if he wishes to find another woman or she wishes to go somewhere else, he has to give her a get. A get would be needed. But at this point, she's not living with him. There's no chuppah yet. There's no yichud, and she hasn't moved in. She goes back to her husband's, to her father's house, usually, for about a year. And during that year, she buys all her boudoir and all her furniture, and she makes herself up, and she learns color classes and everything else. 12 months preparation, roughly. And then at the end of the year, second ceremony. You have two simchas for the price of one, or maybe for the price of two, I don't know. Simcha number 2 is the chuppah and the nisuin. And then she goes under a canopy, and they go together into their marital home. That's the second ceremony. Usually the kasuvah is only put into place and into effect for the second ceremony, the nisuin. The kedushin is ceremony number 1. The Gemara thought for a moment, it just said, that he's makadish the second wife on Erev Yom Kippur, not the nisuin, just stage 1. And the Gemara's challenged that to say that, well, hang on a moment, it's true that they are officially married, and he would need to give her a get to dissolve that marriage, even after that stage. However, at that point, you cannot consider the situation to be that of beso. She's not part of his household because she hasn't moved into him. She hasn't moved into him. They're not living together. And so formally, she's not part of his bias. I hope that will be in a second. Okay, so it's not going to work. If all he's done is given her kedushin, then she's not defined as being beso, so he still can't do the avoda on Yom Kippur. We haven't gone far enough yet. So now the Gemara's pacing forward one step at a step, being dragged along, trying to find how this will work in practice. So the Gemara says, no, you're right. The Konis law. So he does do chuppah, big deal. What are we making a fuss about? You're right. In order for her to be considered properly married to him for the purposes of being called beso, to be able to carry out the Yom Kippur avodah, he must have done chuppah. Okay, it doesn't mean they've moved in and living together, not. But that second stage has been done. So on Erev Yom Kippur, he's given her the ring, He said, hurry up, Megudeshes Li. They've been Eidim and everything you need. And then they've gone under the chuppah and they've sung, done the Sheva Brachas, finished. And that's the end. And then she goes back to wherever she needs to be, outside the old city. And then he's got a second wife, and she's called Beso. They may hardly know each other. But at this point, formally and legalistically, he's fully married to this other woman. And so everything's fine now. He has a second wife, and that's the situation that we are now describing of preparing for the woman, another wife. Formally Kedushin and formally Nesuin. Okay, now the Gemara comes up with a bombshell kasha, which knocks all the skittles down in the wrong way. They fly in every direction. Says the Gemara, Im Cain, thank you. So now he is properly married to the second wife. And he is also, of course, still married to his first wife. He's not divorced his first wife. He's got two wives. Fine. There's nothing wrong with a man having two wives. Don't forget, the second wife is really only part of formality in case of the unlikely contingency that his main wife should die. So it's not as if he's trying to have an affair with anyone else as well. And that seemed fine. But there's a really big problem. Havelei shnei batim v'rachmona omar v'chiper ba'ado uva'ad beiso v'lo ba'ad shnei batim. The Gemara now, we should have done this a long time ago, delivers a bombshell to say that if you look at the posuk that says that the Kohen Gadol should atone for himself and his household, it says his household in the singular, which means, the Gemara suggests, he's only allowed to be married to one wife. He only has one household. And the idea of Beso is not to do with the buildings. I mean, you could have 15 wives all living together in one house. That's not the meaning of Beso. It doesn't mean your physical building. We're saying that the word Bais here means the woman he's married to and any family they have between them. If he's married to two women, then he essentially has two botim. He doesn't have one Beso. Beso, Chazal say zu ishto. Beso zu ishto. It doesn't say noshav. It doesn't mean that he's allowed to have wives. So now we're left with an impossible conundrum. He needs to have an extra wife in case his main wife were to die and he's wifeless on Yom Kippur and he can't do the avodah. So we allow him to marry an extra wife on Erev Yom Kippur, and now he can't do the avodah anyway in most situations, because unless one of them happens to die on him, which is unlikely, he can't do the avodah because he's married to two women. We are really into some sort of quandary over here. How are we going to solve this conundrum? So now the Gemara comes into more and more interesting theorizings to try and work out how we can work with these two women, so that on Yom Kippur, he's only married to one. I mean, if you could write, this is actually one of the most funny pieces of continuous Gemara to be found anywhere in Shas, I have to tell you. But it does get quite complicated because the Gemara ties itself up in knots to try and find scenarios whereby he's only married to one woman, despite the fact he was married to two women. The time the Kol Nidri came in, immediately during the service, somehow formally he's only married to one. How do you create one out of two without shooting one? That's obviously one possibility. You could shoot one, but that's not what we want to do. So the Gemara now asks, so the Gemara says, how are we going to deal with this? So first of all, the Gemara is going to be dragged kicking and screaming from scenario to scenario, each of which is challenged as not meeting the necessary outcome, which is that he's only to be married to one wife on Yom Kippur. But it will go through these scenarios. So first of all, the Gemara starts with a very absurd statement. Not a problem. Tehada megorish la. He marries this woman on Erev Yom Kippur, the second wife, gives her kedushin, he goes through chuppah, and then he hands her a get. Begarish la. He's divorced her. It doesn't sound as though he's actually doesn't sound as though anything's actually being gained by this, does it? Because he hasn't got a second wife, which is what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, in other words, this is a statement that's going to lead to another statement, it's going to lead to another statement, right? We're going to pile on to this case of divorce. Megarishlo, says the Gemara, Hadra Kushya, the doctor. Well, then the Kasha comes back again. What do you gain by saying he's divorced her? He mustn't divorce her, because otherwise he's back again with only having one wife, his first wife, and we're back to the risk that she'll die on Yom Kippur. What do you mean he divorces her? The Gemara says, no, I didn't really mean that. He just divorces her. There's more of a compound case, which we'll put together now. Gemara says, look, Sricha, de Megorish la al tanai. He gives her a conditional divorce. And you'll see it's an absurd conditional divorce, which formally might work, which might solve all our problems. So what is the conditional divorce? And that the terms of the divorce are this. To Amala, he says to her, get your head around this, this shall be your get. He gives this to her on Erev Yom Kippur, before Yom Kippur. The moment after Chuppah, he hands her a get, right? You couldn't make this up. And he says, this is your get, Almanas Shatamusi, which will only be in effect if you drop dead tomorrow, right? It's only going to be in effect if you drop dead tomorrow. Okay, so how's that going to work? So let's see. Remember, this is the get will work from now, should you drop dead tomorrow. Yes, it works retrospectively. We have a time warp. We see a few of these cases in the Gemara. It's a time warp. We don't know whether in fact they're divorced or not, as when he gives her the get, because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, if she doesn't die, the second wife, then there is no divorce, and he's been married to her. But if she does die, then essentially they were already divorced from the afternoon before. So why is that going to help? So let me share my screen. The Gemara is going to show that this doesn't work, but let's see why the Gemara thinks it does work first, because this is going to be, and we'll try this one. I'm not sure whether we'll go through all the scenarios in future weeks. They're absolutely mind-bending, right? We're going through here a series of possibilities to see, remember what we want. Married to one wife only on Yom Kippur. That's the only desired outcome. There are two situations we don't want. He's not married to anyone, and he's married to two. Both of those are unacceptable. The only one we want is he's married to one. So this is the scenario. Let me just work it with you. This is the table. Literally, you've got to work through these to see what the Gemara is saying. He's giving a get to wife two, his new wife, to become effective retrospectively only if she dies on Yom Kippur. That's what I've just said is the condition behind the get. So now let's think about what that means. These columns are the possible things that might happen on Yom Kippur. Either only wife one dies, just look at these, or only wife two dies, or neither die. Actually, another one is that both die. Let's leave that out. That's very unlikely, right? These are all the possibilities we might consider. Only wife one dies, which is his original wife. Only wife two dies, which is the one he's just married, or neither die, and they're both living happily. So let's see what might be this. What would be the outcome of this conditional divorce? So let's look what would happen as far as wife one. If only wife one dies on Yom Kippur, what's the status of wife one? She's dead, because that's what it means. She has died. If only wife two dies, and not wife one, what is the status of wife one? She's married. If only wife two dies, wife one is the one he was married to all the while. Nothing's happened. They're married, she's married. If neither die, then neither the get and no one's died, then wife one is married as well. Now let's look at wife two. If only wife one dies, wife two is married, because she didn't die, and so therefore the get given to her is not effective. So she's married. Wife two is married. If only wife two dies, then wife 2 is actually divorced. Isn't that funny? If only wife 2 dies, then the get worked the evening before for wife 2. So she was actually divorced. If neither die, then wife 2 is also married because the divorce didn't take effect for wife 2 and they're both alive. So now how many women exist on Yom Kippur in these different scenarios? If only wife 1 dies, the number of wives that the Kohen Gadol is left with is 1, because wife 1 died and wife 2 is married, so he only has 1. That's great. He can do the service on Yom Kippur. If only wife 2 dies, then wife 1 is married, but wife 2, I mean, she's dead, but she's divorced already from the day before. So when Yom Kippur came in, he was only married to 1 because the retroactive divorce meant that when Yom Kippur came in, the wife 2 was not married to him, even though she didn't die till the next day. Nevertheless, she was already divorced retrospectively, which means again he only has 1 wife. Unfortunately, this one doesn't work. In the scenario that both die, both wife 1 and wife neither die, neither wife 1 nor wife 2, what is he left with? He has 2 wives. Anyway, so what the Gemara wanted to do was to suggest that this scenario might work to ensure what's happened over here, but the Kohen Gadol only has 1 wife on Yom Kippur. The Gemara goes on to challenge this suggestion precisely because the Gemara also drew this table up and worked out that if neither die, then he's going to be left with 2 wives, and that's not right. He can't have 2 wives. He can't do the avoda. So therefore, having given you this suggestion, the Gemara is going to give a series of further suggestions where, a conditional get is given to wife 1 on 1 condition, plus a conditional get to wife 2 on a different condition, and then we go through them all, and bingo, we might have a scenario where he will turn out to be married only to 1 wife on Yom Kippur. I've only at this point shown you this first gambit, and I've shown it to you because the Gemara was enthusiastic this might work, until being challenged and just shown that this column unfortunately spoils everything. If neither die, then he's married to 2. And I think we'll stop the rather strange share at this point. I'll just stop sharing. The Gemara's got himself into a bit of a tangle, not allowing a scenario of no wives and not allowing a scenario of 2 wives, but demanding that another wife get married. Can you see why we're in this amazing conundrum, trying to find a solution out of the thicket? And I think the Gemara will eventually find a solution out of the thicket. But it's amazing how hard the Gemara will have to work to try and find a solution. Anyway, I'm going to stop recording at this point. I hope you've found it entertaining.